You see the towering glass, the endless headlines, the gold letters stamping the skyline. But behind the glitz is a labyrinth of calculated risks and financial brinkmanship that, honestly, almost defies belief. How do you construct an empire that survives massive financial collapses, intense legal scrutiny, and the most polarizing political environment in modern history? Well, let's dive right into the hidden machinery behind one of the most famous names on the planet.
Welcome back to Vault Theory. Today, we're breaking down how Donald Trump went from a young real estate developer to one of the most recognizable and controversial businessmen in the world. We're looking at a story of absolute, extreme audacity. From his early days leveraging a broken city's bureaucracy, to dodging catastrophic billion-dollar casino debt, to seizing the ultimate political power. This explainer is going to take you straight inside the very mechanics of his survival.
And man, what a survival it's been. Just look at this number. Today, his reported net worth sits at an estimated $7.2 billion. Now, that figure sparks a huge curiosity hook right off the bat. How does a guy survive a massive $450 million civil fraud judgment, strict financial monitors, 4 major corporate bankruptcies, and literally decades of relentless public scandal to actually reach a number that's staggering? To answer that, we really have to ask ourselves, how do you build a multi-billion-dollar empire on the public's dime? Because the truth is, the playbook for this entire empire wasn't invented in some luxury Manhattan penthouse. Not at all. It was forged decades earlier in the outer boroughs of New York, using a very specific strategy. Profits are strictly privatized, but the risks, well, the risks are heavily socialized. Which brings us to Section 1, the foundation of an empire. Fred's blueprint. You see, to understand the son, you absolutely have to understand the father. Fred Trump was a titan in his own right, but he didn't cater to the ultra-elite. He built his fortune in the shadows of government bureaucracy. Fred's strategy, quietly building middle-class housing in Brooklyn and Queens by aggressively exploiting FHA, Federal Housing Administration loans. In fact, back in the 1950s, Fred was actually hauled before a Senate banking committee for securing millions more in government-backed loans than his projects actually cost, and basically pocketing the difference. He was a master at using public programs for private gain. And Donald? He took that exact same philosophy of leveraging other people's money, but aimed it directly at the hyper-luxury, high-stakes world of Manhattan. Let's look at his early timeline to see how this builds. Donald was famously rebellious as a kid. So much so, his dad sent him to the strict New York Military Academy in 1959 to kind of channel that aggressive energy. And he actually thrived there, getting promoted to captain. By 1968, he graduates from the prestigious Wharton School with an economics degree. But his real graduation was taking over the family enterprise, renaming it the Trump Organization, and immediately setting his sights across the river. By 1974, he was locked and loaded for his first game-changing move. But wait. Before we get into his Manhattan conquest, there's a hidden financial mechanic we've got to talk about. Over the decades, Fred and Mary Trump transferred over $1 billion in wealth to their kids. So how did they dodge hundreds of millions in taxes? It all comes down to incredibly complex trusts and loopholes, mainly something called the stepped-up basis. Basically, this allows inherited assets to be adjusted to their current market value, legally wiping out generations of deferred capital gains taxes. The Trump children effectively paid an astonishingly low tax rate of just about 5% on this massive wealth transfer. The foundation was literally rock solid. All right, let's step into the 1970s. Section 2, conquering the Manhattan skyline. At this time, New York City was teetering on the edge of total financial ruin. Crime is soaring, businesses are fleeing, bankruptcy is looming. But where everyone else saw a dying city, a 29-year-old Donald Trump saw the ultimate leverage. He rolled out what will become his signature playbook. Step 1, find a failing property. In this case, the decrepit Commodore Hotel right next to Grand Central. Step 2, secure completely unprecedented tax abatements from a desperate city government. Step 3, leverage the family name and political connections to secure financing. But here is the crazy, suspenseful part of this whole thing. He didn't actually have the money to buy the hotel. So, how do you buy a massive hotel with empty pockets? Enter what we'll call the phantom deal. He pushed the city for a 40-year tax abatement, which was totally unheard of for a luxury hotel. When city bureaucrats finally asked for a signed option agreement to prove he actually controlled the property, he just sent them the paperwork without the final signatures. And incredibly, the city just kept moving forward as if he owned it. He bluffed the entire New York City government. It just proved that extreme audacity was his most valuable currency early on. That phantom deal ultimately gave us the Grand Hyatt Hotel.
And the cost of that unprecedented tax abatement? $410 million. That's the estimated cost to New York City taxpayers over the 40-year term of the deal. He perfectly executed his father's Brooklyn playbook, taking a public subsidy meant for neighborhood revival and weaponizing it to build an untouchable private fortune in Manhattan.
And he immediately doubled down on this strategy for his absolute masterpiece, Trump Tower. His structural ingenuity was brilliant. He bought the empty air rights above the neighboring Tiffany's store for $5 million, legally allowing him to build his tower 20 stories higher than zoning allowed. Meanwhile, leaning on his notoriously aggressive mentor, lawyer Roy Cohn, he ruthlessly sued the city to grant him a 421A tax break. Now, that was a program meant for affordable housing, which he successfully twisted to fund a hyper-luxury Fifth Avenue skyscraper. But what happens when the master dealmaker decides to take all this capital and bet it on the riskiest game in town? Which brings us to Section 3, the Atlantic City Illusion.
By the 1980s and 90s, Trump expanded his empire into the New Jersey casino business, relying heavily on incredibly dangerous junk bonds to build massive monuments like the Taj Mahal. Just look at the data here. It's dramatic. The Taj Mahal opens in 1990. By 1991, it's crushed under an unsustainable $3 billion debt load and forced straight into bankruptcy court. Trump Plaza and Trump Castle swiftly followed. He had personally guaranteed hundreds of millions of dollars of this debt. The empire was quite literally teetering on the edge of total collapse.
It got so desperate that in December 1990, just to avoid defaulting on an $18.4 million interest payment, his father Fred had to step in again. Fred literally sent a lawyer to Trump Castle to buy $3.5 million in casino chips, just to infuse raw cash into the business so they could keep the lights on. The Casino Commission later fined them for what was effectively an illegal under-the-table loan. He was inches away from losing the whole shebang.
Which brings us to one of the most fascinating questions of his entire career. How did a string of massive corporate bankruptcies actually end up protecting his personal wealth? Because while small businesses, contractors, and bondholders lost hundreds of millions, the Trump name survived.
The secret sauce lies in the mechanical loopholes of corporate restructuring. He strategically took his casino holding company public. And by doing that, he cleverly shifted his massive personal debts onto the balance sheets of the casinos themselves. He transferred the enormous financial risk directly to public stockholders and bondholders. So while the casinos bled money year after year, he retained control of the board and just kept collecting millions in personal salary, bonuses, and brand licensing fees. He survived the wreckage by building an absolute fortress around his personal fortune, totally walling it off from his corporate failures. Okay, Section 4, resurrecting the Trump brand. By the early 2000s, his reputation as this invincible dealmaker was, well, pretty bruised. He needed a serious reinvention. And the vehicle for this resurrection wasn't a glass skyscraper. It was primetime television. Producer Mark Burnett came to him with a concept that would literally change American history, The Apprentice. Trump himself actually admitted the power of television editing, noting in 2004 that the show allowed him to analyze people, fire them, and somehow that transformed him from a tabloid ogre into a nice guy in the public's eyes. Burnett deliberately engineered the illusion of absolute flawless business mastery. It took a man who had been tabloid fodder for debt and divorce and completely repackaged him for middle America as the ultimate decisive boss. It sold the American dream of pure meritocracy with Trump sitting pretty at the very top. And talk about an incredible financial lifeline. He was pulling in a staggering $1 million per episode, and he did 185 episodes. The Apprentice didn't just inject a mountain of cash flow into his pockets, it completely rehabilitated his brand on a massive global scale. He wasn't just a New York developer anymore, he was America's CEO. Which perfectly sets the stage for our final chapter. Section 5, Politics and the Empire. In 2015, that polished television persona rode a golden escalator right into the political arena, permanently colliding his real estate ventures with raw political power. So what does the vault actually hold today? Despite intense courtroom battles and a massive civil fraud judgment complete with a financial monitor watching his every single move, the core of the empire remains Manhattan real estate, sitting at around 50%. But notice the 31% from Brandon Media Ventures, which includes Trump Media. The organization has miraculously survived recent interest rate hikes by strategically refinancing key properties like Trump Tower and 40 Wall Street just in the nick of time. And while the brand definitely faces fierce political backlash in progressive cities, it is aggressively expanding through incredibly lucrative licensing deals in places like Oman and Florida. The cash, it just continues to flow.
Which leaves us with this final, provocative thought. Fred Trump taught him how to leverage the system. Manhattan taught him pure audacity. Atlantic City taught him how to survive a complete collapse. And reality TV, that taught him the ultimate power of the brand. As he navigates his second term in the White House, will the ultimate blending of immense political power and a polarizing global real estate brand define his legacy as a sheer master of survival or a permanent monument to controversy? That is the architecture of the Trump empire. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and I'll catch you next time on Vault Theory.